Alrighty. Well, welcome to another episode of Mass Media Rewind, where we go back through all sorts of media texts, movies, TV shows, books, contextualize them, and we respond to their messages. So, my name is Miles Elaine. Today I'm joined with Tyler Walls.
Hello.
So, Tyler, you saw Tenet. How long ago was the last time that you saw Tenet, do you think?
I think the last time I went and saw it was, a month after it came out. So, whatever time that was, I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, so that was back in 2020, and today we're taking a look at Tenet, which is arguably one of Nolan's biggest middle fingers to the status quo of film. And Tenet, I mean, it's not like a normal film. It's dialogue, it's pretty sparse, it's and unimpressive, honestly. The audio mixing is weird, and the visuals were really complex. All these things, though, they allowed for this hyperfixation on critical thought and a controversial but elevated break from the stagnant grammar of film. So, all in all, we're kind of talking about, how Tenet breaks away from normal movies, because it's definitely, like, you would say it's different than like a Marvel movie or like the Bond movie that we saw recently as well, right?
Very different. It is a very different movie from, your usual Marvel superhero movies that have been coming out.
Yeah. Well, so for the rest of our viewers, we're just kind of going to describe what Tenet is in the case that you haven't seen it. And I'm pulling this from Alicia Burnett from the Brigham Young University, who summarizes the film as such. The film, Tenet, in 2020, is a spy thriller about a protagonist who is fighting to save the world from international espionage. After a distraught end to a fast-paced opera heist, the protagonist starts a new heist with the code Tenet to discover a nuclear World War III plot. The plot is surrounded by items that are inverted, where their entropy runs backwards. The protagonist meets Neil, who helps with the espionage plots, and both of them begin to deal with Sator, an arms dealer using inverted items. The protagonist uses Sator's wife, Kat, to get closer to him to discover how Sator plans to destroy the world. Through worldwide travel in Mumbai, Estonia, and Vietnam, the spy team find turnstile machines that invert humans and items. The plot runs forward and backwards through a car chase scene and through a week in the past to stop the completion of a device, the algorithm created in the future to destroy the world. The spy team tries to stop Sator before he terminates the world through radiated items that have come from the future by inverting themselves into the past and to rescue the algorithm. By the end, the protagonist realizes that he is from the future, that him from the future has overseen the whole project. This movie, it was weird, and that plot alone, just a summary of it, is already pretty complicated. And because of this weirdness, Tenet it received a lot of criticism because it isn't a normal movie. On IMDb, the Metascore for that was about a 69, but if you actually click and look at all the reviews there's about half of them that are 100s, perfect 100s, and then the rest of them are in the low 60s, 50s, and even the 40s. The biggest arguments from this was that the sound was terrible. So what did you think of the sound whenever we were watching the movie?
Personally, whenever I watch movies, I'm more into the story than I am about how, good the audio and visuals are. So for me, I didn't really notice any of the sound, being that terrible. Like, for me, I probably would have been one of those guys who rated it as 100 on Metascore.
We're probably going to dive into that sound thing a little bit later. Another thing was that the plot was confusing and requires rewatching. An overcomplicated take on a Bond-esque film was one of the big arguments. In fact, Donald Clark makes a good point on this. He says, it suffices to say the protagonist in Christopher Nolan's latest epic, Sudoku, who is actually called the protagonist, is faced with significant menaces, no less daunting than the challenge of facing the film itself. More often than not, the reasons for each subquest are unsatisfactorily explained. Snatches of the character's future and past appear fleetingly in the corner of busy frames. Gwimp, plutonium, Borch, bungee jump, Robert Pattinson mutters over Goranson's rumbles, and the roar of an endlessly doomed jumbo jet. It's hard to work out what's happening. It's harder still to care. People were harsh with this film, and it's kind of weird how much negative criticism that it got, given how arguably well received Inception and Interstellar and Dunkirk were. Another one, information overload and too many questions. This comes from Variety.com. They argued, quote, I honed in all right. I furrowed my brain and concentrated on every moment. Yet the more I honed, the more questions I had. Questions like, does the person moving backward in time have an advantage? Is the outcome of the fight preordained? If so, what's at stake? And by the way, what the fuck is going on in this fight anyway? The questions were not fun ones. It felt rather as if I was designing a pop quiz for myself, one that I was doomed to fail. The movie made you ask a lot of questions when you're watching this, and this was designed for the viewers, but people got almost upset with the fact that you're just asking them to think a little bit more with the movies. Because when you watch a normal Marvel movie, I use that because that's kind of become the staple of modern film, is there's nothing really crazy that you got to be thinking about. The plot's pretty self-explanatory, and the fact that Christopher Nolan dared to make people think about complex topics, as he's done in all of his past movies, wasn't really received the best. Another argument, and this is kind of from the broader perspective, comes from the box office of when this was released. So we watched it within that first week, Tyler and I mean, I thought it was pretty good.
I also thought it was a fantastic movie.
But apparently Warner Bros., the people in charge of distributing the movie, were not happy with it. Coming from directly from their studio, it says, this is not how Warner Bros. Expected it to go, even in their worst case scenario. They are not happy with these numbers. I've never seen a studio hide anything unless they're disappointed. If you have something to crow about, that is, something that's exciting, they'll let the world know. What's crazy is that in the box office, Tenet did okay, maybe? I don't know, it's estimated that it was about $400 million is what the break-even point was, but within the box office globally, Tenet's estimated to make only $364 million. We don't exactly know, though, because Warner Bros. Didn't tell us. They kept the information secret to themselves, which is probably because it didn't do too well, and they weren't very happy about that. So, my argument here is that this film was a really good one. And its lack of reception arguably comes down to just people weren't prepared for a film that broke the norms of modern movies. And it seems as though this kind of grammar that's set for, popular, action, hero, spy, thriller films, that's become what's expected. And any movie that tries to break away from that isn't met with oh, that's unique, that's really exciting. It's met with opposition, and rather strong. So, one of the most notable things about Tenet is its exposition, or rather the lack of exposition, regarding all the characters, and an overall bad job on the dialogue. Studio Binder is a really cool website that they go through scripts and rate the movies without ever watching the movie in the first place, and then go back through the movie to get the scenes that they need to contextualize everything. And Chris Heckman from Studio Binder did an analysis on Tenet purely from just the script itself. And what he found from it is that Tenet, it's almost used as a tool to comment on its own narrative and the tropes of standard films. And this is why we see the main character named the protagonist. It's jesting at itself, almost breaking the fourth wall. Quoting from the article, if you're considering writing a screenplay, it may be best to stick to tried and true narrative tenets, almost the namesake, like giving your character backstory and give your character depth. But that didn't really happen in Tenet. In fact, most of the time you're trying to figure out what the story even was, much less what the characters were, how they related with each other. It was weird. The protagonist, as the article argues, is a conduit for us to experience the story, much like a static video game protagonist. Through him, we experience developments in real time. We're not given any information about the protagonist's background, life story, or interests outside of the main narrative. Now, we're both Colorado Mines, School of Mines students. We play a lot of video games. It's what we do. Tyler, what do you think about this idea that the protagonist in Tenet similar to other games?
I think the one thing that the protagonist really does that is super similar to video games is, I mean, obviously you already said it before, you live through the narrative, and the movie does a really good job of making you also live through his own narrative. And I think the protagonist does a really good job of almost figuring out like who he is. He's trying to figure out himself, and it's not just us trying to figure out who he is, but also him trying to figure out his own story.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because it's like obviously he's a character removed from the film itself, but he constructs almost the entire plot, at least what needs to happen within it. Yet the future version of him isn't present, but some of the characters, like Neil, know him pretty intimately. It's a bit weird, and because of this, on one hand, I mean, we can almost say that protagonist lacks character depth and character development. We've seen that within the criticisms, but you wouldn't, I wouldn't argue that. You wouldn't argue that. Even Nolan himself probably wouldn't stand against it. There's a reason why the character lacked development, though. If we say the protagonist is a conduit or a reflexive character, then it doesn't matter much if he lacks depth and development. It allows for an easier self-insert so that you can enjoy this crazy, wacky story through the protagonist's eyes. And ultimately, the protagonist, he works as this meta-reference to an already meta nature of the story. He's a great fan cut from the protagonist's best moments of the film. And that's kind of what makes this enjoyable, is that as a movie, it's able to critique itself of saying, we took this kind of standard idea, this Bond-esque movie line of there's a bad guy who wants to destroy the world, and the protagonist just wants to, stop that from happening, but has to figure out the larger story first. And it takes this kind of surface level narrative and then says, now let's take away all the, requisite script things that need to happen and instead just see what we can do with that. And I think Nolan did a really good job at testing the waters there. Furthermore, Heckman argues that the characters in Tenet, they're purely pawns to illustrate the rules of the game. You're ultimately, throughout Tenet, trying to figure out how does this concept of time work. Because you're able to send objects, as normal, the way that we perceive it. So you can send objects into the future because they're just naturally going to go, forwards, entropy-wise. This movie's idea is that things can go backwards. So dropping a bullet and that's moving forwards is just going to drop. But if a bullet's moving backwards and you intend to drop it, it's going to seem as if it picks up and comes into your hand against gravity. It's weird. And so throughout this movie, you're trying to figure it out, and it's all about answering the questions. So other characters, side characters like Priya, Crosby, Ive, and Niels, their dialogue is almost entirely focused on answering questions. Like the scene with Crosby, that was the old guy, the same guy who's in The Dark Knight. The entire thing that the protagonist is asking is he's just asking questions, not a single valuable piece of input other than questions. Like Crosby was describing the reversed plutonium, the plutonium-241 that's brought up in the movie. And he goes on for, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute about what this plutonium being reversed means. And the only response from the protagonist is nuclear as a question. That's it. Nothing greater than that. It's a bit weird. And it's a lot like the movie itself. It's like when a teacher gives you a couple of readings to do and for class, and then the class itself is used as a forum for discussion. Likewise, Tenet is using the film itself to fuel a larger discussion around it. You have classes that ever, just say, read this stuff and then we'll talk about it in class at all?
Yep, every house class I've ever taken.
And within those classes, do you think that having those readings beforehand makes for a more natural discussion? Or do you think that people are ever opposed to having, sort of extra content to base their discussion from?
For me, it's necessary that we have that pre-reading, that we're able to get a little bit of context, because, coming to discussions in class, I mean, trying to walk in and come up with stuff on the fly, I think for a lot of people is really hard. And for people who, are used to planning and used to talking about, things like with a plan in mind, like coming to a school like mine's where people plan all the time, that's like the one thing that we love doing. But I also think there's something to be said about, not having any idea about what you're going to be talking about and then having to formulate those opinions as it comes up. Because I think that's something that, like, much like we're talking about with this movie, is, a real life thing where we have to, come up with our opinions on the fly and come up with ideas on the fly.
I think that's the idea that Nolan's trying to hit to, is that there's one thing to say that, the movie should stand for itself, but I think that it's really standing as kind of that background information to then spark those discussions. And this idea, like, it's, not like it's pulled out of thin air. Like, it's not a 2 by Neil's role. So that's who Robert Pattinson played. He has points of dialogue that references knowledge about the whole operation, which we discover at the end that he's kind of the protagonist's protege that's taken over this and is training up the young protagonist himself. But when he first meets the protagonist, for example, he already knows that he doesn't drink on the job. And similarly, whenever you see the Freeport scene, so in the airport when they're fighting against each other, he stops the protagonist from killing his future self. So it's like Nolan's intending for us to go back, watch this, like just like in a class when you're referring back to the source material. And it ultimately speaks to this argument that Tenet is purely about the concept rather than the narrative itself. What matters is it's just a tool to explore this idea of time. And this moves us into kind of how Christopher Nolan did this. The first one actually comes to a big source of criticism, which is regarding the audio mixing. A lot of people complained about the audio. And the reason is because people were like, I can't hear what's going on. You remember that boat scene whenever they're in the, like, racing the catamarans or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And there's crazy loud music going. They're talking through these headsets, and the audio for them is still coming in on the headsets instead of being redubbed over. People got mad about that. And it is a bit weird. The Hollywood Reporter, like this isn't something new for Christopher Nolan. They noted this back in 2014 with regard to the sound in Interstellar. Quoting from the Hollywood Reporter, like one key point that sound and visuals are for Nolan are a tool that are often underutilized in film, and Nolan wanted to use them more. Quote, many of the filmmakers I've admired over the years have used sound in bold and adventurous ways. I don't agree with the idea that you can only achieve clarity through dialogue. Clarity of story, clarity of emotions. I tried to achieve that in a very layered way using all the different things at my disposal, picture and sound. All too often in film, people are relying on purely just a script, as if they were still in a radio theater or doing a podcast or writing a book. But film offers both picture and sound as additional tools that you can use. And Nolan happens to be one of the first people to tap into that as the sole sources of ideation and creativity, rather than just being extra things that you have to fill in as part of the story. More from Christopher Nolan. He said that we made carefully considered creative decisions. There are particular moments in this film where I decided to use dialogue as a sound effect, so sometimes it's mixed slightly underneath the other sound effects, or in the other sound effects to emphasize how loud the surrounding noise is. It's not that nobody has ever done these things before, but it's a little unconventional for a Hollywood movie. The idea is to experience the journey the character is going on, he said. For instance, the experience of being in a cockpit is you hear the creaking of the spacecraft. It's a very scary sound. We want it to be true that the experience of space travel, that is in Interstellar, we wanted to emphasize those intimate elements. And that's something that people get mad at because they don't know, is this audio important, is it not? But Nolan's argument, not only in Tenet, but in all of his films, is that sound is, and specifically dialogue, is just a tool to give a sense of what's going on. If you can't hear it, that's okay. Richard King, the audio mixer for Tenet, among other movies like Inception, Interstellar, and Dunkirk, he actually submitted a post to Ask Me Anything on Reddit. Oh man, Reddit, it's such a crazy place. But here he described that Nolan's general argument for sound. He said, Chris is trying to create a visceral emotion experience for the audience beyond merely an intellectual run. He wrote in 2018, like punk rock music, it's a full body experience, and dialogue is only one facet of the sonic palette. He wants to grab the audience by the lapels and pull them toward the screen and not allow the watching of his films to be a passive experience. If you can, my advice would be to let go of any preconceptions of what is appropriate and right and experience the film as it is, because a lot of hard intentional thought and work has gone into the mix. So this is once again reinforcing that idea that Nolan uses audio as a tool, and that's not normal, right? Like you'd never see that in a Marvel movie. You wouldn't see it in Harry Potter, of this sound as a tool thing, unless it was like super clear, because maybe Harry Potter, a wand blast cuts out the audio of what someone else is saying, but then there's no dialogue whatsoever. I don't know. I think that Christopher Nolan uses it more as a way to enhance realism, because there are loud sounds in the real world. It's not like it's just coming out of thin air of, oh, train horn came by, now you got to stop talking. Sometimes you're going to keep continuing on. But as this kind of camera viewing in on life, people try and edit that out. Christopher Nolan says that's done. We ought to just use it as part of the realism to create these very vivid emotions. And watching the scene in the Freeport, so that's where they're in the art area, and then there's a turntable in the innermost layer there. Where the sound in that, when they're first explaining what's going on, it's being overwhelmed by Ludwig Göransson's score. While the features are being explained, it's supposed to kind of build on this feeling of just establishing the visuals. The words don't really matter all that much. It yields a narrative setup of the structure of the Freeport, which is visited twice more in the film. The only critical part, the detail that the fire prevention system would suffocate anyone who didn't get to an escape door, was singled out, and the score was rebalanced with the audio. Other scenes, though, like that boat racing scene that we were just talking about, were argued as being particularly hard to understand. In this scene, the protagonist, Andrew Sader, the primary antagonist, link the details for the missing plutonium-241, which has been a common thread throughout most of the movie, and it establishes the protagonist cover while also showing Sader's suspicions of the man. After which Kat, the Sader's wife, she released him by the safety harness, and he fell into the ocean. This whole thing was argued as being incomprehensible for the audio, but only to some, because as you said, there were no points where you felt like you couldn't hear what was going on. And this actually speaks to a greater part. There was a interview with Christopher Nolan regarding Dunkirk, and he said, "We made the decision a couple of films ago that we weren't going to mix films for substandard theaters. We're mixing for well-aligned and great theaters." So when we listened, we went to, I forget if it was the IMAX or the Regal Special or whatever it was, but it was a nice theater with like the reclining seats and everything like that. And everything sounded really good. But apparently if you have, just headphones on or a really bad theater, especially for like the home versions of this movie, those audio clips didn't come through. And Nolan made a bit of a weird decision of, instead of making this perfect for everyone, I'm going to make it perfect for the people who are actually going to care about the film. I don't know. I think that that's perfectly reasonable. Do you think that it's unfair to maybe viewers that don't have the money to go see this stuff? Is it like a new elitism? What do you think, Mr. Walls?
I'm not sure what I think about that, because on one token, I can really see, like, if you're really trying to make a movie that, you're going to make as detailed as this one, the audience who's going to have to listen to it is going to have to be just as invested into watching it as, the person was who wanted to create it. And so if he's going to put this much effort into a movie and this much detail, like, I think he's just asking for the respect of maybe those who see the movie as what we're talking about and are trying to figure it out and reading through not only the audio hints that he's hinting at, but the rest of the story too. So I think it is perfectly reasonable that Christopher Nolan is looking for something like this, but maybe Warner Brothers was taken back by it when the box office sales didn't see what they were planning on seeing, and so maybe Warner Brothers is a little more upset than Christopher Nolan was.
For sure. And I think definitely, there's value for going to see a movie the way that it was expected to. But it's not like you couldn't turn the subtitles on if you're watching at home. Like, if you bought this off Amazon and you're like, oh, I can't hear it, with any other show, you would just flick closed captions on. But for some reason, since people have read an article on this already, they get mad whenever they can't hear it without turning that on. I think that's a bit unreasonable. But on the note of this kind of, once again, breaking the film norm and exploring the concepts at large rather than a standard narrative, we get into the visuals of the movie. And visually, like in Tenet, the visuals are spectacular. In the Freeport scene, when they crash a 747 into the side of a building, that wasn't just visual effects. That was a real airplane that they destroyed. That was a 747. Because it was apparently easier to do it that way. Likewise, the colors in scenes like Red Room, Blue Room, where they go through the turntables after the first part of the car scene, the very scenes at sea when they're on the cool boats, and the urban environments that they show, they all make brilliant use of these gels for lighting, and they use unique architecture to reinforce kind of the global nature of the plot. Because they went all over the world for this, which was cool. I mean, that's kind of, in line once again with that Bond style narrative, or maybe more of a Marvel thing where you're going all over the world. And for each region that appears, there are clear separations, which adds to this realism of the film, because you didn't get confused of where they were once they said, like, oh, we're going to Ukraine. It was very clear what parts of the scene were in Ukraine. But one of the things that's a bit weird that he does is this idea of spatial temporality. Now, a standard in the grammar of film or any narrative work involves the dilation of time. Every story requires the omission, slowing, fast-forwarding, and reordering of events, a manipulation of time in order to construct an enjoyable work. If I was going to tell you about my time back in Kansas City, I wouldn't start from day one and go all the way chronologically in full detail until I came out here for school. That would be unreasonable. Nolan's focus on time, though, instead of going with the standard route, it takes this standard and it expands upon almost like a postmodernist notion that we're disconnected from reality. The free violation of logical norms is no greater than the separation between man and society around him. In other words, when he's throwing away forward time and reverse time willy-nilly, it's almost saying, like, it doesn't matter what's on the screen, just enjoy it. And what he does with this is, like Tenet specifically, among many of the other Christopher Nolan movies, is uses a spatial mapping to create a sense of temporality in a way that no other film does. So Inception, for example, have you seen Inception?
I have seen Inception.
It used relative distance in the dreams for each death to show how long time lasted. So you had a plane, a car in a city, the hotel, that whole mountain-based thing, and then the endless expanse whenever they were in lingo. Mm-hmm. Quoting from Morose, he argues that the various dream levels are designed by the architect that transforms the subconscious space into the form of a labyrinth that seems like a real place taken out from the real world, where the monitored subject cooperates without any suspicion. For this reason, the dream space is shared, and it is based within a generated reality of the people that are present within the dream space. In other words, they're able to create the separation of the time, because time got dilated the more, the deeper that you went into the dreams. like 5 minutes on that, or 8 hours on that plane ended up being like 60 years when you got down to lingo. That's crazy. And the way that they did it is by creating these very clear distinctions between each of the scenes. And that was the first exploration of time within a Nolan thing. Still kind of classic going forward. Interstellar gets a bit more weird. As Morose writes, quote, "In Interstellar, space and time do not function as a transparent framework within which a narrative unfolds itself. Instead, it is precisely the fundamental undecidability of spatio-temporal relationships that appears at the center of the narrative's own impossibility, which makes Interstellar go against the flow of conventional cinema. While in films like Back to the Future, the idea of time travel often encourages narratives about traveling freely around, performing heroic and epic rescues, in Interstellar, Cooper is trapped between time and space as everyone in this extra diegetic world." Long story short, for Morose's argument on Interstellar is that we see, once again, a break from normal film. So Christopher Nolan, he's basically showing, instead of, there's a clear separation between when you go back in the future, you're on a separate timeline, as seen in most movies and TV shows that mess around with time. Instead, you can only go forward in this one. There is no backwards travel, and the only time that we see any connection between the future and the past is through that weird fourth dimension as a spatial dimension of time, when he's going through the bookcases and trying to communicate with his daughter. And that's weird. That's a break. Both of these go to show that Christopher Nolan's used to breaking from the norm of film. But Tenet is where stuff gets really, really weird. So Tenet, he uses the red room, blue room, the turntable, or the turnstiles of going into between times. It blends the directions together. And this hasn't been done before. Rather than making an entirely different dimension or going to a different area or showing that there's a clear separation when you go back in time, you're just going reverse in the same physical space. And this makes it fundamentally different than any other interpretations of time by other narratives. So Kevin Lynch, he was writing back in the 1970s about how we as humans mentally interpret cities and their functions with their various paths, nodes, districts, landmarks as a separation of space. So if we were to go into like Denver, you'd be able to see where the roads are, where the buildings are. You can navigate your way between that. You're able to, instead of just viewing it as an entire just single object as a city, you can separate out smaller components and figure out how to navigate that, right?
Right.
Like if you were to go in Denver right now and you had to get from point A to point B, how would you do it?
For me, I personally would pull up Google. But, in the context of what you're talking about, obviously just following street signs, following, whatever I can see, whatever I can, get around to. That's essentially the way that I'd get around the city.
And you can break it down between that and picture it in your mind as instead of just one giant mass of stuff. Like you can process through that slowly as a spatial area.
Right.
And you create almost like this map in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is what Kevin Lynch leads into arguing is like a cognitive graph theory of instead of it just being cities, everything that we view is separated spatially within our minds. And Morose, the author of the current article that we're on, he extended this to argue that the depiction of time in Tenet, it's just another cognitive mapping. So Tenet's break from the norm is that instead of using directed graphs, they use undirected graphs. That is to say that on a normal graph between point A and point B, you can only go in one direction. Otherwise, you need two separate lines, like arrowed lines. In Tenet, you're able to go from point A to point B on the same path, regardless of what direction, which is weird because we're talking about time here. So if you wanted to, like on the highway, drive down as they do in one of the scenes here, instead of having two separate highways and then just one of the highways in reverse instead, you have a car driving backwards, but the car itself is technically moving forwards. It's just going backwards in time, all in the same space that normal traffic is going. It's a really weird scene. And the characters, they can all exist in the same physical space, despite this separation in time. Hence, we see overlaps, such as in the airport scene, where there's 3 of the protagonists all literally in the same area. Or we see it with the car chase over the algorithm, where the protagonist, there's 2 of him, and there's also 2 of the satyr, the main bad guy. It's a really weird thing, but you're able to have this overlap within the same physical space. And this depiction, it creates almost a mystification, labyrinth, or surprise of the environment, similar to how a man walking in a city would find it surprising if there was a road missing or something like that, or if traffic was suddenly going both ways on the same lane. That'd be weird. And Tenet explores this concept as a visually, and just asks its users to witness how weird it would be if our normal perceptions of going through a physical space were entirely changed by changing the way, just slightly, the time works. And this film's really, really weird. It gets weird. It stays weird. But that's almost intentional. This brings us to the next section, was about paratext and film theory. So Nolan's hyperfixation on exploring this depiction of time travel and reverse entropy, it ultimately leads viewers towards an end goal of critical thought. Now, we mentioned this at the start of the podcast, but a lot of people found the film confusing and were offended by the disregard for the audience's initial standing and enjoyment. But I would argue that this was intentional. See, Nolan's movies are about more than the film itself. Rather than the movie, it encompasses not only the content projected onto the screen, but also all the various media artifacts that are generated surrounding the film, the paratext, so to say. Inception, for example, and Interstellar, they generated massive amounts of paratext because the commentary nature of the films. Nolan iconically invites his audience to take the questions brought up in the theater home and to ponder them. So when you finished Interstellar, Inception, Tenet, surely when you got done with it, you weren't just done thinking about the movie, were you?
No, you spend probably your entire night. You probably end up dreaming about the fact that, you've been sitting here contemplating the movie and how it works and the different niches that were implemented in the movie. So you definitely spend a lot more time outside of just the movie, both talking to friends, family, whoever you went and watched it with, and then even trying to argue with yourself about how the movie worked.
So Nolan, throughout these films, it's offloading the commentary that would normally be encapsulated in the film, and then you're done, you go home, and then it's cool. Maybe think about it for a little bit, call it a night. He offloads the commentary by creating this ambiguity in his films. He doesn't answer everything. So Inception, for example, generated that ambiguity via its deeply multi-threaded plots, because you had 5 layers of dreams plus reality. And then the top level, which was presumed to be reality, may in fact be a dream, because there's that top spinning scene at the very end. And while a lot of people think it stopped, I don't. It's weird. Likewise, Interstellar, they created ambiguity with its physics-centered time travel, and the idea of time is this spatial dimension, because that was the whole bookcase scene and just the way that gravity altered time. It was weird, but the confusion in all of these, it's very easy to see that it's intentional, because it allows for a multitude of smaller creators to capture the reactions and things like YouTube videos, podcasts like this one, articles, and even entire books. People have written books on Christopher Nolan's works because they are weird. And so after seeing the hype generated by this intentional ambiguity, it'd be a no-brainer for Nolan to want a repeat with Tenet. So he sought to create a narrative that would be sufficiently enjoyable, but as ambiguous as possible, which is a daunting task. So he had to get just enough details to interpret what is going on and support and allow you to support your own theories without explaining everything to you. Because a lot of movies, like, once again, jump back to Marvel, jump back to Harry Potter stuff, really any mainstream movie, they walk you through the entire process. There are no open questions, and if they are, they're either really brief or regard just what's the next movie going to be. That's it. Like, any commentary that you've seen on, a Marvel movie, what was it?
Commentary meaning like what?
Like what other people were saying, or YouTube videos on it, or stuff like that.
Aside from the fact that it was for future predictions, I haven't seen very many other commentaries for those kind of films.
It's because there's no room for these commentaries. But Nolan views his intended audience as this mature group, and just like people who are just as involved in the theory of film as the film itself. So unlike standard films, he doesn't hold your hand through the movie. This isn't Harry Potter or Star Wars, where everything is served on a silver platter. Those movies treat their viewers like kids with those shape-matching puzzles. Where does this cylinder go? That's right, in the circle hole. But no, Nolan trusts in the minds of his viewers and wants us to actually do some critical thinking for once. And this is probably the biggest point of, contention against his films, is that you have to think about it. I think that's crazy that's like what society, gets everything up in a wad about, is just not giving everything to you. But I think that almost makes it more fun than everything else. So, overall, looking on what's gone on in this very short, somewhat long podcast, Tenet, it's abandoned the tropes of modern film. Well, this film may have like a surface level similarity to like a Bond movie or any other spy chases bad guy and saves the world narrative. The production has a strict divergence from its predecessors. Nolan threw out typical exposition and dialogue-heavy script as a rejection of the tenets of typical narration. He used a unique audio mix to immerse his readers in the surreal world of varied timelines and focus his efforts on a visual script that would rework spatial temporality in a way that had never been done before. The viewers part with a lingering enigma that rewards further discussion and debate. Tenet stands as a masterpiece, detached from tradition and unrivaled in its effort to inspire critical thinking and exploration. That's all that we have for this episode today, but Tyler, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, hope y'all have a wonderful time and stay tuned for the next episode.